In the last class, we talked about various definitions of abnormality and also how mental illness is currently defined according to the DSM-5. Next week, we're going to be talking about various theories that exist about the causes of mental disorders. But in order to lead into that, it's important that we look back and consider how mental illnesses have been viewed and explained throughout the course of human history, and also how those definitions affected how mental illness was treated. One thing to remember is that there are a lot of different reasons why we have theories of mental illness. In an ideal world, we develop theories of mental illness in order to help people who are struggling. Also true, however, is that we have theories of mental illness in order to help the rest of society make sense of behavior that's different. Now, sometimes this is rather innocent, simply trying to explain differences. Other times, these theories were used as reasons for controlling, excluding, or punishing people who are different. So what we're going to do in this lecture is talk through the history of how mental illnesses were explained, and as a result of those explanations, how individuals with mental illnesses were treated. Now, there's evidence to suggest that mental illnesses have been part of human existence since prehistoric times. During this time, evidence suggests that theories of mental illnesses were dominated by mystical or supernatural views that assumed mental illnesses stemmed from magical beings or powers that interfered with the mind. As a result of this, treatment often involved attempts to cast out these magical beings or powers. At times this took the form of exorcisms by shamans or other spiritual leaders. But there's also evidence that suggests that trepanning or trepanation was also practiced. And trepanning was based on the idea that symptoms of mental illness were caused by spirits that were trapped in people's heads. So the cure for this was to drill a hole in the person's skull in order to allow the spirits to escape. Now, this might seem like a rather prehistoric practice, but just as an aside, there's evidence that trepanning was done well into the 15th century. What's more, there's also evidence that people actually survived these procedures, and the way that we know this is because we found skeletons that demonstrate healing around the trepanning holes, so the person obviously lived long enough for that healing to occur. Moving ahead from prehistoric times, in ancient Greece and Rome, there was actually quite a bit of writing that was done about mental disorders, and based on that writing, we know that a lot of different types of disorders were identified, including things that today we might call depression or melancholia, mania, dementia, hysteria, delusions, and even hallucinations. And during that time, explanations for those mental disorders fell into one of two camps. So Camp 1 was in keeping with explanations from prehistoric times that suggested mental disorders were caused by spirits or gods. When this was judged negatively, treatment often included exorcisms or other spiritual interventions, some of which were designed to make the body an inhospitable place for spirits. But spiritual possession wasn't always judged negatively. For example, Socrates believed that mental illness was actually a gift from the gods, and considered it to be a positive thing rather than something that was shameful or problematic. And he wasn't the only one who felt this way. In Phaedrus, Plato was quoted as saying, "Madness, provided it comes as the gift of heaven, is the channel by which we receive the greatest blessings. The men of old who gave things their names saw no disgrace or reproach in madness. Otherwise, they would not have connected it with the name of the noblest of arts, the art of discerning the future, and called it the manic art." So, according to the evidence provided by our ancestors, madness is a nobler thing than sober sense. Madness comes from God, whereas sober sense is merely human. Camp 2, on the other hand, considered mental disorders to be caused by organic or natural causes. So you had scholars like Hippocrates who believed that mental illness was caused by an imbalance in the four humors, which were phlegm, black bile, yellow bile, and blood. And also Aristotle, who was always well ahead of his time, who theorized that mental illness may have been genetically determined, or at least passed down through families. Based on these beliefs, treatment also involved bloodletting, but not for the sake of making the body inhospitable, but instead so that the humors could be rebalanced. Other treatments also involve things like bathing, exercise, and diet, all of which were intended to strengthen the body. As we move into the Middle Ages, the explanations of mental illness began shifting a bit. The predominance of Christianity throughout Europe led to a continued reliance on demonic explanations of mental illness. Exorcisms were still performed, however, Christians believed that only the grace of God would cure mental illnesses. However, other explanations were still fairly popular, including the belief that mental illness was caused by changes in the moon, hence the word lunatic, meaning moonstruck or moonsick. It was also during this time that we see the first established institutions where individuals with mental illnesses were treated. So in this painting from the 13th century entitled Reception and Treatment of the Impoverished Sick in a Monastery Infirmary, we see monastic monks caring for those with mental illnesses. As such, prayers, potions, and relics were often used to bring people closer to God in hopes of recovery. Despite this, many people were cared for at home, locked in jails, or simply left to wander the countryside, which was creating significant issues, particularly in more populated areas. Because folks wandering around not being cared for and not having resources to care for themselves invites both the opportunity for those individuals to harm others, but also for those individuals to be harmed. As a result, as we get into the beginning of what is now considered to be the Renaissance period, hospitals for the mentally ill were established. And that's all well and good, particularly when you only have 6 people in residence. But as you'll see moving forward, it's not like we knew much about how to care for individuals with mental illnesses. And part of that was because there was still a lot of variation in explanations of why people suffered from mental illnesses. So although there was increasing attention to organic causes, sort of a return to theories related to imbalances in the humors, which was again treated with bloodletting and in more humane context, diet and exercise. But after the Black Plague killed off about 30 million people, organic theories of any kind of illness, mental or physical, were supplanted by a return to supernatural or demonic explanations. In particular, in the mid-1400s is when we see witchcraft trials erupt in Europe. Now, the witchcraft trials, in particular who was targeted by those trials, have been explained in multiple ways. Some historians have suggested that the trials were provoked, at least in part, by clergy members' anxiety about the sexuality of women. Religious persecution was also a key component of public belief and punishment of witchcraft. So there is considerable evidence that the trials were used as a way to purify society. So individuals who were on the cusp of society, for example, more independent women who had knowledge of herbs and healing, and who therefore had power in society, were often targeted. But evidence also suggests that individuals who had symptoms of mental illness were also accused of witchcraft. Now, all of this came to a head in 1487 with the publication of Malleus Maleficarum, or the Witch's Hammer, which was a witch hunter's guide written by 2 friars at the request of Pope Innocent VIII. The Witch's Hammer attempted to put to rest the old orthodoxy that witches were powerless in the face of God to a new orthodoxy that held that Christians had an obligation to hunt down and kill witches. And the Malleus Maleficarum made arguments for the existence of witches and provided proof that witches were mostly women, telling tales of women who would have sex with any convenient demon, would kill babies, and even steal penises. In addition, the Witch's Hammer identified ways to pick out a witch, deviant sexual behavior being one way, and also indicated that insanity was caused by possession by the devil. Because of the belief that insanity and witchcraft was caused by demonic possession, treatment of the times was focused on ridding the body of spirits. Salvation of the immortal soul was considered more important than the comforts of the possessed body. As a result, physical punishments were used to make the body an intolerable refuge for the devil. Now, although it is certainly the case that some of this inhumane treatment was being conducted in town squares, as the Renaissance period progressed, more and more institutions specifically devoted to the housing of individuals with mental illnesses were cropping up. And that's what we'll talk through in the next online lecture, the history of asylums and how they shaped the treatment of mental illness.